Why, hello there, Celine.
Hi.
Uh-oh, that is the wrong camera. I better fix that real soon.
There you are.
All right, there we go. I need to also mute that tab. So here I am sending you text messages like mute your tab because otherwise you're gonna lose your mind. And I didn't mute my tabs. But that is that. Hey, you look like you're in quite the library right now. That is quite a background you have there.
Yeah, it's a
Um,
Zoom miracle.
I know. And how are you? We're gonna
Good.
start there. Excellent. All right, so folks, here is what's up. We're gonna spend the next hour, and I'll let Celine introduce herself in just a moment. We're gonna spend the next hour going over tips for reading and dealing with poetry, and tips for planning for your question three literary argument. Now, y'all might say, but why is there no love for the prose? And the reason why is because the strategies that we use for question one and question three can actually be pretty well integrated into the question two. And most of the time, my students struggle with one and three the most. And so, because of that, that's what we decided to hit for today. Now, I am here with the one and only Celine Gomez. Celine, when I mentioned it to my students earlier today, I was like, hey, I'm going live with Celine Gomez tonight. They were like, wait, Selena Gomez? Do you know who that is? And I was like, Celine, she's actually way cooler and way more popular
And
than that.
older.
But before we do, and before Celine, I let you tell everybody who you are and what you do and all of your incredible accolades. We got to give some shout outs here in the chat because people are coming from all over. We've got a Ms. Baker who needs a shout out. We have a Mrs. Austin, Mrs. Altamirano, I think is what that is. Is that how you would pronounce that?
Sounds
All
good.
right. All right, cool. Mrs. A. I'm glad that the Mrs. A is just an A, so I could just say A and not botch a last name here. Okay. Ms. Brandy Anzaldua? I don't know. This is the hard part when I have to try to enunciate names that I just don't know. But from Cy Falls, apparently we're supposed to love her though, so we want to make sure we do that. Shout out to Lake Mary High School. Someone's telling me to chill out, I guess. But I don't know. That's okay. Shout out to Mr. Martin, Mr. Hurst, Ms. Austin. I think we already said that. Dr. Guitar. I wish my name were Dr. Guitar. That would be a pretty awesome name. Although I have to admit, I do think the best last name for a teacher to have is Savage. And I work with two people with the last name of Savage. And I wish that people could be like, oh, we have to go to Mr. Savage's class or be rather daunting in there. Mrs. Robinson from RPHS period 3 AP Lit. Shout out to you, Miss Charles, Mrs. Austin, and Mrs. Comstock. So to all of you, oh, and Mr. Brayton, to all of you, and if any more names pop up, we'll just shut them out. Please note, Celine, if you see any names pop up while I'm talking, just interrupt me, shout them out, because these teachers need to know that their students appreciate them. And I actually appreciate you, and I want people to know who you are. So, Celine, can you tell us where you teach, what you do, what your connection to the AP Lit world even is? Because your connection is way better than mine. And then we'll start talking about things.
No, hi. I'm Celine Gomez. I teach in Plano. It's a northern suburb of Dallas. I'm at Plano West, the West Wolves, and I have been teaching for AP Lit for over 20 years. I've been an AP reader for or since 2005, so longer than many of the kids or all of the kids have been alive.
This will be year
Um,
20 for the reading. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, for you, right. Awesome. And do you do anything else at the reading? Are you involved in like reading leadership or anything like that?
Yes. So
I
over the
assume.
course, yeah, over the course of 20 years, I started out as a reader.
Yep.
Then I was a table leader, and then I was a question leader, leading one of the exam questions. And then now I'm an exam leader. So I lead
All
all
right.
forms of one of the questions. So, uh,
So you're like the expert's expert, and we should listen to everything that you're going to say here today to help us out. That's
well,
what that's what I
try.
heard. Yeah.
I'll try.
All right, a couple other shout outs real quick before we get into things. I'm gonna start by asking you some questions, Celine, about some of the things you do in your classroom. And then if you want to share your screen, if you want to talk about things, we can do all of that kind of stuff. But I do have to give a shout out to Keefe Tech, particularly Mrs. Sullivan. Keefe Tech is the one of the vocational schools that's about 4 towns over from me. They also have an incredibly awesome principal over there. Maybe she's an assistant principal named Dr. Swavey. She's pretty awesome. Mrs. Sadie, Mrs. McDaniel, Ms. Austin, again, Rahway High School, Mrs. McDaniel, and then Boone County High School to Ms. Richards. I think if that's the Boone County in Kentucky, I actually met a student in Kentucky out of nowhere one day. She came up to me in a store and was like, I think I know who you are. I'm from Massachusetts. I was in the middle of nowhere in Kentucky. And she's like, I think you're the guy from the Garden of English. And it was actually really, really nice. But anyway, so Celine, let's actually start with poetry because we need to talk about tips for reading poetry and tips for writing about it. So let's really start with reading. But my first question for you is, when you think about your students, first of all, do your students struggle with poetry the most when they come into your classroom?
Yes, I think mostly because the way that my students go through the AP classes is their junior year, most of them will take AP language. So they're focused on rhetoric, argument, and then it really doesn't lend itself, or it's not assessed on the exam, poetry. So they don't
Right.
have a lot of experience with poetry in their classrooms until they come to AP literature. And so it's a kind of revisiting of something that they haven't done in a while. And so they're not as comfortable with the form.
Right. And so, what we're going to do when we talk about poetry, as we think about what kids struggle with, is, and I want everybody just to hear this, we're going to talk about reading poetry and responding to poetry. We can talk about essay stuff. So, if you all have questions about essay stuff, if I can catch it in the chat, I'll bring it up with Celine. We'll talk about that too. But we really want to focus on reading poetry because that will help us on our multiple choice and it will help us on the writing about it too. Okay. So, I just want to make sure that everybody knows that. And when we talk about the essay part of it, we'll go in order of thesis, evidence, and commentary and sophistication, folks. So if you're like, how do you get the sophistication point? How do you get the sophistication point? Give us till around 7:30, folks, or 7:40 before we talk about that, because we want to talk about strategies for reading poetry. But you're right, Celine. And actually, my students take AP Lit first, and then they take AP Lang as seniors. But what's really interesting is that I just think that poetry is just rather neglected on the whole in most schools now, especially because it seems that a lot of the Common Core stuff pushes teachers towards consistently doing nonfiction or adding more and more nonfiction. And poetry is usually what gets the chop because it's hard. It's hard. So, besides the fact that your kids don't have tons of experience with poetry before they come in, what are some of the other issues that you think your kids come in with that make dealing poetry a little bit inaccessible for them?
I think it's the reading of poetry,
Yeah.
the different forms. And I saw in the chat, and it looks like I'm looking to the left because I'm looking at another screen.
Yeah.
One of the students asked if they would have to be identify the specific kind of poem. That
Yep.
won't be a requirement. However, your exposure to the different forms and understanding how the structures help inform meaning are going to be key for you as entryways into the text. In particular, you mentioned in the chat, the student mentioned a sonnet. That's really
Yeah.
going to make it more accessible to you in terms of unpacking meaning. And frequently, sonnets appear in the multiple choice section where you have to answer questions over analysis. And there's going to be either 2 to 3 poems, and they'll span either pre-20th, well, they will span pre-20th century and contemporary poems, which
Yeah.
you've done in your classes. And you'll also be asked in one of the 3 essays to address a poem. So if it happens to be a sonnet, and that has occurred multiple times over the administration of the exam, it
Yeah.
provides you just another tool to be able to respond appropriately and to go in depth in your analysis with
All
an
right.
understanding.
So let's actually talk about that here a little bit. So what is the easiest strategy for me to know if a poem that I'm looking at before I even read it is a sonnet? Like what's my go-to?
First thing, does it look like a box?
Okay. So sonnets look like a box.
It looks like
Cool.
a box. A
Yep.
little bit more precise. A sonnet is simply defined as 14 lines.
That's
So
right.
if you have 14 lines and it, just visually it looks like a box immediately, you have an indication. And they're probably going to stick to one of the 2 traditional forms. And you've been
Yeah.
exposed to those in your classes. There's no way you've gotten around it. The traditional Shakespearean sonnet or English sonnet or Elizabethan sonnet, it's just different names for the same thing,
Yeah.
or the traditional Italian sonnet, the Petrarchan sonnet. And again, we're not asking that you label them. It's just your understanding of the difference between quatrains and a couplet, or an octave and a sestet.
Right. And so what that means, folks, is if you haven't actually been exposed to this idea of a sonnet or the Italian or the English sonnet, the way that sonnets work, and this is the most common type of form poetry that I think that you do see on the AP Lit exam. Like, I don't know the last time I saw a villanelle on the Lit exam. I'm not going to lie. Can you think of the last time you saw a villanelle on the Lit exam?
Not for a free response question, but it may
Right.
have occurred in the multiple choice. But again, they're not going to ask you what is this specifically. It's
Right.
just going to be obvious to you. In particular, like a villanelle, you'll see the repetition
Right.
of the lines and the rhyme scheme.
Right. And so because of that, right, I think that form wise, the most common one that you'll be able to actually write about too is typically a sonnet. You see those pop up a little bit more. So folks, Celine mentioned the octave and the sestet. That means that there's one type of sonnet where 8 lines happen, and then there are 6 lines that basically present some sort of contrast, because that's what sonnets do. They create a contrast. And if we're trying to approach poetry and we realize that the poem is a sonnet, we need to just say to ourselves, there are 14 lines there, so I need to figure out where this contrast is. And if it's an Italian sonnet, that contrast is going to really show itself right in between the 8th and 9th line, most of the time. But if it's an Elizabethan sonnet, there are what are called quatrains. That means that there are 4 lines that go together, followed by 4 lines that go together, followed by 4 lines that go together, and it ends with a couplet. And that couplet is typically where you see the most significant contrast. That would be the Shakespearean sonnet. Now, Celine, do you want to correct anything that I just said there about that?
Absolutely not. I'm just
Okay.
looking at some of the chat. One student asked what time periods. You're going to have to know the course itself. In the course requirements of your skill set is that you are exposed and able to analyze pre-20th century poetry. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have to know poetry from the dawn of man,
Yeah.
but it's going to be something pre-20th century. So you frequently will see poems, 1800s, 1900s. A lot of the sonnets, though, will go back further, and you will
Yep.
need to know contemporary poetry, the 20th, 21st. In recent years, they've been leaning more heavily on the contemporary pieces, but that's not any kind of guarantee.
Right. And actually, another thing too, right, is we just want to make sure that people are realizing we're not saying you have to know, like, you don't need to come in knowing poems, like particular ones. They're not going to be like, who wrote this poem? On my teaching exam, I had read the selection who wrote it, but that's a teaching exam, right? We're just saying that you need to have experience reading poetry. And the truth is that you actually have a way into this in your lives, folks, because a lot of you all, um, a lot of my students, when they see poetry, they automatically like give up right away, which is really, really odd to me at the beginning, because they're like, I don't even know what this says. I don't even know what this means. And in fact, there's even a question in here that says, can you help me understand poetry? Because it sounds like jibber jabber, skadoodle noodle. And I appreciate that. I think that we should write a poem like that, Celine. But poems that are on your AP exam, folks, are purposefully chosen because they should be somewhat accessible, if not entirely accessible. And it is actual language that is meant to communicate meaning in an artistic way. And I know that most of you spend a lot of your days reading text messages. And a lot of those text messages are emojis. And if I show an entire set of emojis, you all can be like, I know what that says. And you can go through and tell me all of what those emojis mean. And now we're giving you actual language, and you're like, I don't know what it says. I can't even attempt to try. Or you put in all of your little slang in your text messages that aren't even complete words or ideas, and yet you communicate that way. So we have to take those skills and translate it into actual English art, because we're giving you language that's like that, folks. So just one thing is, rather than going in saying, I just can't understand this, have some confidence, because you absolutely have the deciphering skills, even if you don't know what some things mean, because you do it all the time while you text. Excuse me.
And not
So
even just the form of texting, but most of you are very adept at listening or looking and examining song lyrics, and your teachers may have incorporated that as well into some of the lessons. And that particular type of writing very much mirrors both in the rhythm and the rhyme, and the sort of truncated language, where they're not explaining everything in great detail, but they're offering you enough points of reference that you can make those inferences, and that you piece together from one stanza, so to speak, in a song to the
mm,
next.
right, and it's funny that you mentioned that, because I was going to mention that too. So we can come in with already making cohesive ideas out of things that are not necessarily cohesive, but we know that they're intended to be, so we do. But the song idea, I mean, folks, we listen to music, we listen to those lyrics, and I'm going to just celebrate that. because you need to come in with confidence. I actually think that for my students, most of the time, it's their lack of confidence that actually hurts them when writing poetry or reading poetry and writing about it than anything else. But so let's actually answer one of the questions from the chat before we actually talk about legitimate reading strategies. Like, okay, we know that there are different types of poems. Not every poem on the AP Lit exam is going to be a sonnet. We just said, hey, look out for it because it's really about contrast. But there is a question here that says, how can we know an overall mood created by a poem? If your student were to ask you that in class, hey, Ms. Gomez, like, how can I do that? What would your response be?
One of the big things too is to look at and identify the speaker. We know you cannot make the assumption that it's the poet,
Right.
unless there's information provided, or you have background information knowing that. So
Yes.
assume that you're being tasked with identifying who the speaker is in this poem. And then I would say to start look at some of the verbs that are being used. What is the speaker? How is the speaker using particular verbs? And then start to immediately try to see what the conflict, the tension is existing for the speaker. It's always going to be that. Even if you go back to your basics, all of you know your basic conflicts, right? Man versus man, man versus self, man versus nature, man versus society, and start to think about populating specifically how you know what that tension is. And then you're going to be able to build from looking at the verbs in the poem, and then as well gathering information when you look at specific types of language that you notice, specific types of figurative language that you notice. It's not a hunting and pecking for that, but as you start to see the imagery itself develop, tone is a construction. It's not something you're going to be able to point to. It would be nice if I could say tone was listed on line 9 of the poem, but it's going to be piecing it together. So I saw this word, I saw, the connotation of this verb. I was able to understand the speaker was having this particular kind of conflict or tension. And then you're able to piece that together, putting together point of view, figurative language, imagery, all of those things are going to come together. Even the syntax, the way that, you see the language being presented in terms of sentence structure.
Absolutely. And I always tell my kids, if they're trying to figure out tone or mood, and although they're different, you can still use the same strategy. I always say, go look for the words that you can group at the very base level as being positive or negative. And then I say, okay, now we could start looking, because if we start seeing a lot of negative words, I then have to say, do I ascribe that to the attitude of the speaker? Because if that's the case, it's going to be a negative tone of the piece. And then if the speaker is attributing that to creating some sort of atmosphere for the reader to experience, then we're going to have a negative mood. And I always tell kids, diction determines tone, and word choice determines the mood as well. And I always say, start with the positives or the negatives. So when we think about the images that you were just talking about, those individual words, particularly the verbs, that's key here. So before we take more questions here, Celine, I want to talk about accessing poetry. So we have students. We know that they're going to struggle with poetry. My students do. I'm sure. Well, I'm sure your students do to a certain extent, but they do have the one and only Ms. Gomez as their AP Lit teacher. What is the?
I need you to tell them that.
Yes, right. Well, you know what? People did tell my kids that too about what I do in my classroom. But nonetheless, what's the first thing that you're doing to help kids read poetry better in your class? So, like, the first step ever for a kid, what is it that gets them to start engaging with a poem when they don't want to?
And actually, I want to just share a slide if you don't.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Let's see. Hold on. And make sure I'm sharing the right thing. Okay, not that one. Are you seeing the slide?
I'm seeing the slides.
Okay.
We're good.
So, we were talking about my students, much to their delight. They were looking at poetry. Well, they were looking at all 3 prompts just the other day. And so this is one of the slides that they were working with. And these are just sort of 4 immediate steps that I had up on the board for them as a reminder, because it's something that we all do, right? So, up there in the clock, I don't have a live clock for you, but I have 8 to 10 minutes.
I'm going to interrupt you for just 1 second. I'm sorry. Somebody did ask if you were willing to share this slide deck. Are you willing to do that?
Yeah. I'll
Okay, and the only
let
reason
Tim
why I
link
asked,
it.
okay, I was saying if you send me the link, I can put it right in the description down below when we're done. I've got some other resources down there already right now, but we can totally put those in. Pardon my interruption, Celine. Back to you.
Not at all. I prefer that. It feels like we're in our own little world here. I can see the chat running to the side, but I'm used to more like interact. I mean, interact.
Right, and we can't just have a Zoom that everybody can chime in. I totally understand. Yeah,
So, one of the things that I'm looking at are these sort of 4 action steps, and I think the first step is really what we've been talking about, just a sort of what you notice. It's not the laborious annotation where you're looking for all of the things. You've been trained, like kids, y'all have been trained. Your teachers made you slow down so that you realize the craft moves that the writers make, like they exist in the poem. So things are going to stand out to you. And exactly what Tim mentioned earlier, once you start noticing the positive, the negative, or even if you just literally put, plus signs and minus signs, and you start to see a pattern, it's grouping together patterns that you notice. And so a first read, it's simply that you're not looking for the right answer, you're looking to find an understanding. And so step one is really what do you notice? Just sort of annotate. And all of you are doing the digital exam. My students have been doing the digital exam, and you have the capability to annotate and it'll save. You also will have scratch paper. So there's certain things that you can write down. And I don't mean sentences, I mean words that stand
yeah,
out to you. If that's easier, you can start to group together patterns of language in that manner and start to decipher for yourself what it is that you see happening. The other thing that your teachers have always asked as you're reading and reading carefully through this is not just what you notice, but what we had mentioned earlier. When you see like a shift, those shifts, we know where to look for in some structured poems, but in all of the poems that you're going to be given for the exam, there will be a shift. It's going to be part of the complexity, and that's part of your task, is to be able to understand that shift, whether it's point of view, whether it's in subject, whether you see those patterns of language shifting from positive to negative, or even if it's more of a nuanced gradation, like it's getting harsher, it's getting a stronger emotion. And so really to know what happens before and after the shift that you are seeing develop those patterns. So even if you start with understanding the language and then seeing what you group together and then establishing a before and after, it's not different than when you think about the rhetorical structures. And I think you've mentioned this. There's going to be maybe like a before and after, a cause and effect, a movement within the poem from ignorance to knowledge. It
yeah,
might be something else, like from a dark metaphorical darkness to a light. I say that because that connects with a poem that I brought here for us to look at today.
yeah.
But being able to see that shift is what's going to be key to your understanding the complexity. And the complexity in the piece is a task of the prompt. It's going to be a task in every prompt. That's
Right,
it's not an option.
right.
Um, I'll let
And I
Tim.
always tell my students, that shift happens. I'm like, or good authors give a shift, right? Like that's the whole point. And especially on the multiple choice portion of the exam, when I have my students read, the first thing that I require them to do is to just break the poem into sections. Well, actually, there's one other thing I require first. I'll tell you that in a minute. But once they break it into sections, I then say, okay, good. Those sections that you had, explain to me why you thought there were shifts here, because those are the paragraphs that you're going to write in your essay. Because every shift that you have, well, I thought the author was doing this here, and that's what made this section kind of relate to this section, but not quite be in that section. And that's really what we're asking kids to do. You're noticing shifts and contrasts, and that develops complexity of ideas. Now, I will say that with my kids, before I let them mark shifts, oh, one other thing about shifts, um, I have noticed, and this is entirely anecdotal, and so Celine, you correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that most of the non-holistic questions on multiple choice, like the overall mood of the piece, or the overall tone of the speaker, or the overall thematic venture of the pieces, for the questions that are more specific, most of the line-based questions I have noticed typically happen where I mark shifts while I read. And I'm like, interesting. So if I can mark the shifts now, when I get to my question that's actually about that particular line, I've actually already subconsciously thought about the answer to that question because it relates to the shift. Now, do you concur that many of those questions go with the shift, or are you like, Tim, I don't know what you've been reading the last couple of years?
No, it's exactly right. I mean, the multiple choice is directly connected to essay writing. I mean, being
Yeah,
able to understand a poem and to analyze it is all that the multiple choice is doing. They're just
yeah,
providing the answer options. Whereas in the essay, you're the one who is providing the responses. So in essentially that's what you're doing. Your essay could be crafted. I mean, if you want to do multiple choice practice and just take the stems of the questions and the correct answers, you have essentially the outline for what would be a good essay, pointing
right.
to evidence that's relevant, evidence that's sufficient, all of that. The other thing that I have there is write a theme. Themes are not required in poetry,
Yep,
but you
right.
do have a full text here. It's a
Yeah,
complete poem. So you have the whole beginning, middle, and end of this work. And I think that one of the ideas, I know you're going to get to it later with sophistication, is always, well, there's four pathways to sophistication. The first one is really delving into the complexity, really understanding the tension within the piece.
yeah,
So having a thesis and having already noted that is leading you on that pathway. I'm not
hmm,
saying it's guaranteed, but it's definitely pushing you in that direction. The
right,
second pathway to sophistication is perhaps putting it in a broader context. And that broader context can be understood in multiple ways. One of the ways is really identifying a universal idea. The poem does arise out of a time and place, but literature endures beyond that time and place
yeah,
because a theme speaks to the human condition, human
right,
nature. And so, as you are starting to understand those tensions and complexities in the piece, you see its relevance beyond just what's confined here within that text. And so, a theme asks that you make those text to world connections. I tend to speak about sort of the proverbial uh, window, mirror, or door for
yeah,
theme. And I say proverbial because it's just like that. When you say theme for like a mirror,
yeah,
when you read this poem, even though I'm not that speaker and I don't have these thoughts per se about nature, I understand what the underlying conflict is or the tension, right? What that's bringing about. Maybe feelings of isolation or feelings of connectivity or finding an identity through reflection, being alone in that some kind of contemplation.
yeah,
And a proverbial window is maybe I don't see myself like a mirror, but a window is that I am like this voyeur, right? I can watch everything unfold in front of me, and then I'm able to make a comment, like having observed this. I mean, we talk about literature as being an act of empathy or sympathy. I mean, having read this, having spent time analyzing it, I understand something about people, about the way people interact, about the way somebody responds to something. Or it's the proverbial door. I had no idea any of this ever. I had never thought about it. I'd never been exposed to it. And until I read this particular piece of text, now I'm like walking through a door of understanding. Like I might come into some kind of epiphany
yeah,
about the world of ideas even.
right,
And so again, it's not required, but I do ask my students to do it because on the exam I've only seen it rewarded. When you look
yeah,
at larger or when you look at more successful essays, a lot of them go to those larger ideas. They start
yeah,
small, some of the specifics within the poem, but then they're also able to make those abstract connections, and the connections are what literature is about. It's part of why we talk about it being the humanities.
right. And I want to just kind of clarify just a few things for some individuals out here who might not have heard of like the idea that you don't need to put theme in your response. Um, and one of the things is so I think about my favorite poem to actually talk about with my kids that is a sonnet is the For That He Looked Not Upon Her. I think it was from 2014. And the prompt said, analyze the literary techniques that the poet uses to convey the speaker's attitude or complex attitude. And I always tell my students the prompt is actually keeping you in the text with the speaker. So that means that every time you make a suggestion in your writing, you need to be saying something about the speaker's attitude. You can't just say it's complex. You need to say, here he recognizes that he's in pain. Here he recognizes that he doesn't want to get caught again. And here he recognizes that she's still a wicked fly honey, so he's super tempted, right? And so I'm like, that's how we have to kind of work through this. But the prompt actually allows us to write a paper just about the speaker in there. But it sounds to me like you're saying, if we move to that thematic venture, that's going to only let us be rewarded as opposed to not. So the question that I saw in the chat was, and Mrs. Austin must have told all of her students that they get extra credit for asking really good questions, but a lot of these questions from Mrs. A's class have been great. There's just so many of them. I'm like, oh my gosh. One of them was something along the lines of, how do we get to theme, right? And with poetry, because it can be hard, because poetry can be hard to read. And one of the strategies that I give my kids for practicing this is, I like to tell my kids, I want you to look at particular images. And a lot of times I like to use like 3-frame comics. Garfield works really well for this, or single frame comics like Family Circus, or just like comic strips. The Peanuts can do this. And I like to say, okay, look at this. Calvin and Hobbes works great. How did I forget about using Calvin and Hobbes? But I typically say, look at this particular image in this frame of the comic and link it to just an idea, one singular abstraction. And if Calvin's in the picture and he's just, right, my kids, I hope, will write boredom. And they'll give me some sort of idea that will correlate with that picture. Then we'll move to the next picture, and I'll say, what are the ideas that this relates to? And then we'll look at the third and we'll do the same thing. And then I will ask them to write a thematic statement that includes the relationship between those ideas. So folks, if you're reading a poem and you think you have the gist of it, and you know what's literally going on in the poem, because that's the first thing my students have to do. When they read a poem in one long sentence, they have to write out a summary of what's actually happening. Give me your best shot, even if you get it wrong. And then I say, good, break it into sections. And then for each section that you had mentioned, because good poets give a shift, I then say, write at least one idea word next to it. So if you see this particular set of lines talking about a guy who doesn't want his son to grow up, I hope a kid will say either maturity or anxiety. And I'm like, good. So now you know what's going on in that character's life, this father who doesn't want his son to grow up, and you know that it relates to this universal experience of anxiety. And so I try to get kids, when they read poetry for me, to get them in, do your best to tell me what's actually going on. Focus on that first. Don't jump to the abstract yet. Let's be super factual. Then let's break it into sections. And then we just put singular idea words down the side. And then when they write their thematic statement, they have to talk about the relationship between at least two of those idea words.
Yeah, and I think that that's exactly how I was just looking at the most recent comment or question in the chat.
Yep.
By breaking the poem down by those shifts, if you work your way chronologically through the poem, then you won't repeat yourself, because you'll be dealing with new bits of information. You're not going to jump around in the poem. So for your body paragraphs, I would say look at that first chunk of text that you identified before the shift, and enable yourself to do that all in one complete body paragraph, and discuss the insight that's associated with it, and whatever you see and how you see the author creating that meaning, and discuss through your analysis the effects of those elements within that set, that chunk, that set, and then move into your next body paragraph to make your next claim, your next assertion with the next set of lines that you've identified. So just move through the poem with your analysis, as opposed to trying to pick and choose from beginning to end, back to middle, back to end, back to beginning, instead of zigzagging your way around the poem. The poem itself has a structure. It's moving forward with an idea, it's developing an idea. And so you are analyzing what you have, extracted as far as meaning from those lines based on the text evidence that you are pulling. And so I'm gonna, just quickly look here, like I put these 5 things just as reminders, where you're going to be able to sort of see how each of the parts of the essay are crafted. Um, you know, the theme is going to arise from your understanding of that tension and that conflict, because ultimately this poem is not offering a solution. I mean, if we had the solution to mankind's problems or struggles or quagmires or whatever you want to call it, you know, we'd be in a utopia.
Right.
But that's not the case. Every you know voice that we see, they're expressing their interaction with parts of being human. And so when you understand what the text is having to say about that, then you're coming into analysis. And if you are able to identify what's happening before and after the shifts, that's going to help you assert a claim, a defensible claim for those body paragraphs. And again, complexity is in all of your poems. So it's never going to be a singular answer that, you know, the person is unhappy or that the person
Right.
is joyful throughout. There's going to be some kind of contrast, if you just want to think of it in that way, some kind of comparative element that is changing. Look for the changes, if that helps.
And I actually tell my kids that I want their thesis statement to have the phrase "that although" in it. So um, even if they don't include um, a theme, I tell them if it says to analyze the complex attitude of the speaker towards whatever, when they write their thesis, it's going to say to convey or highlight the speaker, that although the speaker blanks, he or she also blanks, because that's going to force them to set this kind of dichotomy up here. I want to just take a quick moment to address some of the questions in the chat, Celine, if you don't
Yeah,
mind.
I figured you should.
Yeah. So one of the questions was, okay, on test day, what can I do to make sure that I have a better chance of analyzing a poem correctly? And one of the strategies that I give my kids is I make them break down the prompt. Now, for everybody who's paying attention here, we're going to get Celine's slides down in the description after this, just because I didn't have them before. Pardon me, Celine. I should have asked you for them if I knew you had them. So forgive me for that. But in the description down below, I have a bunch of stuff that's linked up. For some reason, it's like put together like a paragraph right now, but I'll space things out. But one of the things that I have is a prompt breakdown organizer, folks, and you can actually really leverage the prompt to get some good information that you need to read the poem for. So that's one of the ways that you can actually dig into a poem with the in a quick time, because the prompt gives you enough background to let you know what you should potentially be looking for. The prompt might tell you the following poem details a conflict between a lover and his long lost girlfriend, or something like that. Well, then good. You at least know the relationship between these characters. Now you got to figure out what that conflict actually is and what's complex about it. So I do go how to break down prompts to give you a really good leverage on test day. Another thing that I want to share that's actually already linked up down below is, Celine, I was listening to you talk about shifts, and I was listening to you talk about articulating literary effects. And I actually have a sheet that's linked up down there that I'm going to share right now. And this sheet actually gives students questions that they can ask so that they can always know what the literary effect is of anything that they see. So if they see an area of the text, they can run down these 6 questions and say, okay, what is it that I can understand based on this area that I know is sticking out to me for some reason, but I don't know what the literary effect is? So let me share my screen up here, folks. This is accessible right down in the bottom of the description of this video for you. Okay. And so if you look here, once my students, whether it's prose or poetry, once they can section out the text, my students are going to say to themselves, okay, this section, what can I infer? That means I'm going to take my own assumptions and the evidence of something that's concrete in front of me, because that's what an inference is. It's seen knowledge with assumed knowledge, and you combine them. It's what can I infer when I read this section about a character or speaker's internal traits, an attitude or situation or another character? What can I infer, in the case of poetry, what can I infer about a speaker's relationship with other characters based on this section? What can I infer about a point of tension or suspense from this section? What can I infer about how this moves the audience to experience an emotion? What can I infer about how this section of the text relates to another one potentially in the future? What can I infer about some irony that's being developed here? And then last but not least, what can I infer about an idea that comes up here? And so what happens here is my students now know, oh, if all literary effect can be put into these 7 questions, when they practice for their multiple choice answers are going to be one of the answers to these 7 questions. So I try to get my kids to think with these questions in mind consistently, because that's going to help them with their reading comprehension. And then, like I said, if they get to a section of a text and they're like, okay, I need to write about a literary effect. So the technique is, let's say the author develops a first person narrator. Good. What do I learn from that first person point of view? Oh, I'm thinking about the poem, The Man He Killed, right now. Oh, I learned that this man is really struggling with coming to terms with the fact that he just killed a guy. Okay, I wouldn't get that as much from the third person point of view. So I'm going to write about how the first person point of view allows me to infer this greater internal tension of our character and his struggle. So these questions down here can really help you all to figure out what are the literary effects of things that I'm looking for. Now, Celine, did I miss any awesome questions or comments in the chat there that you were like, oh, you got to go back to that?
They have a lot of really good questions. So
Yeah.
I'm new to this, so I'm going to let
Yeah,
you
that's okay.
for
Gotcha. All right.
for a few of the comments. One of the questions I did notice though was about paraphrase or direct evidence. For my general response is that if there is text in front of you, like with a poem or with a prose excerpt, do quotes.
Praise God. Yes. Thank you.
I,
Yes. Thank you.
there's really not a reason at this point for you to avoid them.
Yeah.
I will say this, you need to be careful that we're not looking, because of the length and the time constraint of the essay. No one is expecting long quotes. We don't really
Right.
want long quotes. I would say, as a rule, like the actual quoted words that you pull, I'm not talking about embedding it in your sentence, on the whole
Right.
sentence. I'm just talking about the actual words that you pull from the text. I would say, as a rough guideline, no more than 4 to 6 words. It's a guideline, people.
Yep.
My kids ignore me all the time, so it doesn't
Yeah.
really
My
matter.
rule is
But
9, so I'm glad that we're good. Yeah.
it's a framework, and I think some of the most successful embedded quotes are where students just pull multiple single words that illustrate what their point is. The evidence is serving as support for you. Okay, you're the one who's making some assertions about your interpretation, so that evidence ought to be carefully selected and used judiciously. Wisely decide what you're going to put in that essay and what you're spending time with. The reader is going to know the poem very well. So it's going to be, it's not something you have to contextualize or set up. Go ahead and just pull those direct quotes.
Yeah. Yeah. I tell my kids all the time, no more than 9 words per quote. And I also saw this question about the seamless integration. Folks, one of the easiest ways to seamlessly integrate your text every time, and I actually have my playlist for all the essay writing underneath in the description down below, folks. So if you've never seen those, I encourage you to check them out, because I say, here's how you break down prompts. Here's how you annotate stuff. Here's how you write thesis statements that are complex. Here's how you write topic sentences. Here's how you integrate quotes. Here's how you provide commentary. The whole works. Okay, folks? Oh, here's how you write sophisticated conclusions. But I tell my kids, the first thing you need to know is that to seamlessly integrate a quote, you shouldn't be able to tell where your words end and the quotes begin if you just read it out loud to somebody else. The other thing that I tell my students is that when they start their second sentence where they're going to put their example in, that they should write for example and then put the word after right there. And the reason why is because when they say for example after, they're going to have to summarize the context of what shows up before the quote. For example, after the speaker blah, blah, blahs, he then moves to reveal that he feels like a mouse that has seldom escaped the trap, or something along those lines. And because of that, because you provided the context, it actually allows you to flow directly into your quote pretty seamlessly. And if anybody wants videos about that, it's in the poetry writing playlist right down below here. And so I do love that you're like 4 to 7 words, because I'm like, oh, maybe I'm not as stingy as my kids pretend like I am. But I do agree. The idea of like copying those, chunks of text down, folks, don't do that. That's not what we're looking for. That's not going to help you out. All right, Celine, question here about the thesis in poetry. And this actually will probably work with prose and question 3 a little bit too, because it's a little bit different with AP Lit. Do kids A, have to list lit devices in their thesis statements? And B, is it I guess, is it a requirement to list devices in your thesis statement, like it is on question 2 in the Lang exam, where you have to put rhetorical choices in your thesis?
No.
Okay.
The mention, the listing of elements is not required. It's the rubric specifically states, is it a defensible interpretation?
Yeah.
So whether you have them present in your thesis or not, that doesn't make it defensible. That's
Yeah.
how you figured out what the poem meant. So if they're there, that's great, that's fine. If they're not there, that's great, that's fine. What we're looking for is the interpretation piece. So I'm not looking at elements. I'm looking for the part of your sentence, or if it's multiple sentences, the part of the multiple sentences that tells me what your interpretation is. Think of it this way. The elements are in the poem. And I could point, like if I asked you like what you called, animal imagery, and I asked you where that is, you could say line 5, line 10. If you can point to it, it's not defensible. If I ask, what does that serve to show about the speaker's complex attitude, the answer to that question comes from your head.
Yeah.
And if it comes from your head, then that's defensible. You use
feel like a
those
victim,
elements
right,
to prove it. I don't need to know at the outset. In other words, I don't need to know at the outset how you're going to prove it. I need to know what it is that you're going to be proving. So I'm looking for what came out of your head. And then
Yeah.
later in the essay, in the body paragraphs, that's where you're showing me, this is how I know what I made in my claim, in my defensible insight, in my thesis. That's how I know it's true. So think of all of those elements as serving as support in your essay to prove your interpretation. But I
And
need to
so,
see the interpretation at the front.
right. And so what normally happens, right? And I'm not a lit reader, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I do talk to lit readers a lot. I do teach AP Lit as well, but so I read my own student papers. I actually have my kids list out literary elements in their thesis statements just so that they have their track, because it's a timed essay, it's super stressful, and I'm like, always let your thesis be your guide. But with my kids, when they list those elements out, when they say in order to, they cannot just say in order to convey the complex character of the speaker. They have to say what the complexity is. So my kids will typically say the author, narrates with this, describes this, and then concludes with it, or adds this, in order to highlight that although the narrator feels this way, also this way, and then they'll tag a universal insight on at the end of the thesis there. But when hold on, the question was, oh yeah, the listing out of those things. I only tell my kids to list out the literary choices because it's a time setting, and if they forget what they were writing about or where they were going, they can just go back to their thesis and be like, oh yeah, I need to connect this point of view, or I need to connect this particular point of conflict to this element of the complex characters. The thesis just outlays it for them on that day. Somebody did ask though, what was the question that fit perfectly into this? I'm sorry.
You're looking for the question. I will say this, with a
Yes.
digital exam,
Yep.
you have the opportunity with very ease to manipulate what your response is. So when you are typing in your answer, you want to create those different lines, those important points that you're thinking about making, and you can just put little bullets if you wanted,
Yeah.
in the text box as you're noticing them and they're popping in your head, and then you can rearrange them very easily. I mean, it's an easy kind of cut and paste when you're typing up your essay. So as you're outline or framing it, the editing process there is, it's a little bit more at ease than when you were doing a pencil and, I'm sure when you're doing a pen to paper handout, right? I told my kids when they were doing the work with the slide that I showed y'all, they had to just do those things. And I told them on the digital exam, I would type those things out. And then essentially you have the outline the bones of your essay. And then you can go back in and fill that in with all that you need later, because it's going to auto save. And say you just map it out and you plan out the structure, but you're not, ready to write it then, or you write part of it. It's something you can easily come back to, and something you can rearrange with ease, because you can move between all three essays at the opening. Remember, unlike the Lang exam, for those of you that took the Lang exam already, language gives you 15 minutes of, extra time to read, to plan, because you have to read source material. We don't have source material like that in the lit exam. So you only have 120 minutes, and your timer is going to list that. No one's going to prompt you to move between essays. So you're going to have to self-regulate. So as you are setting up your structures, it may be necessary that you move to the next essay to sort of tackle it structurally and give yourself sort of a backbone and outline of where you're going with it, and then move to the next one and kind of decide those things so that you can go back in and fill stuff out.
I am going to revert to that question that I found, if you're okay with that.
Yes.
Okay. So the question was, how do I know if something is just a stylistic move in a poem or if it's something that adds meaning? And I think this is especially on test day. So I'm going to give a couple examples, folks, of things that are potentially stylistic, but it's like, do I write about this or not? Okay. And I think that a lot of times, this with my students happens with caesura and enjambment. Now, if you don't know what those words mean, caesura is when there is punctuation in the middle of lines of poetry, and enjambment is when there's not a piece of end punctuation at a line of poetry and it runs into the next one. And so my students know that caesura always is meant to slow down the reading, and enjambment always is meant to speed up the reading. So my students will see it and they'll say, okay, I know that Freitas said the effect of this is to slow down or speed up. But let's pretend we had a poetry prompt that said, analyze how the literary elements and techniques can convey the speaker's complex attitude toward shaving. Okay? If that's the case, and my students realize that there's some enjambment, but they cannot actually connect the idea of why would I need to speed up here with how the speaker feels about the ritual of shaving, my students will just say, I noticed that there's something stylistic there, but I don't know the meaning, so I'm not going to write about it. And I think that what happens is a lot of times kids kind of say, I need to show that I know lit devices. You don't. You need to show that you know how language creates a complex attitude throughout the poem. So another example would be this. If you were to see something and there were some alliteration, you're like, I know that sound sticks out. But if you don't know how that sound sticking out relates to the speaker's attitude towards shaving, then you want to just say, I see the style. I know I'm supposed to notice it, but I can't write about it right now in my lit exam because it's not connected to that, what you said, Celine, that what you know that's a defensible claim. Because when you all of a sudden say, I see the alliteration and it's overly repetitive, just like he views the days of his life, now we can make a judgment here, because you're saying this is factual, and I think this helps me interpret that he's suggesting that life is actually this kind of mundane moment sometimes. Oh, the repetition of the sound and the constant monotonity of it is very similar. But actually, when I think about the poem Shaving, though, I think about the alliteration of all those soft sounds and how everything to him is just a whisper and like a mist. And it's like, oh, well, that's how that correlates. But if you can't pick it up and connect it to what the prompt is asking you for, the speaker's complex attitude towards, or the character's complex response towards whatever situation, then you know it's stylistic and leave it alone. Only focus on the things that help convey that speaker's attitude or the character's attitude toward the setting, whatever the prompt is asking.
And you have to understand that in the time setting and it being a draft, you're not going to be able to include everything that you see. You're not going to be able to include everything that you notice. Part of this task is, as I said earlier, being selective and in deciding what is going to be most effective in supporting your interpretation. It's not about including everything that you had noticed in the poem. And there's a lot of, thorough lines that you can follow. And that's the invitation that literature offers you, that, even as well, I had another, we're not going to have time to look at the poem I had, but if we had a poem in front of us, we would sit here and be the wonderful English nerds that, Timm and I are, and we would
Yeah.
each be throwing out what we see, what we notice, and how I follow that to this end of thought. And, while we would overlap naturally, because we're looking at the same poem, I might follow a different set of thorough lines to come up with my idea, and Timm would do his, and it's valid. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what we're looking for ultimately, is that you are using these pieces of evidence, not that you are including the entire poem in your essay.
Right. I actually, so one of the
I mean,
questions
and the
appeared.
entire poem in terms of words. I want you to look at the whole poem. Please don't ignore,
Right.
like, look at the poem from beginning to end. I just saying you can't include everything that you see under the sun in your essay.
Right. And I actually tell my students, right, they can write a decent essay that will score well with a thesis and 2 body paragraphs. But I always tell them, if you're only going to produce 2 body paragraphs for me, you have to pull from the beginning of the poem, like within the first 5 lines and within the last 3 lines, in order to do that, so that you can clearly demonstrate that you understand the shift or contrast that developed throughout the poem. And we do, in my class, we actually really practice a lot on the 3-paragraph essay, but 3-paragraph timed essay. Not that 5-paragraph essays are the be all and end all, but in a time setting, how do you write more than that? Thesis, body paragraphs, and conclusion. Like I can't do more than that. And I'm a professional author, So just a couple of things about some quick questions that showed up in here that we can alleviate super quick. First of all, we're not talking about FRQ2 today because everything that we talked about in poetry actually applies to FRQ2 besides like caesura and enjambment. So that's one thing. If you want to know about FRQ2 stuff and like strategies for thesis statements and things, just look in the description right down below, folks. There are playlists for all of how to write those essays piece by piece. And every video is like 5 to 10 minutes long with examples that most of them are written by my own students too, by the way. So I take my student examples, I get their permission, and then we put them up there. Let's see. I would like to, Celine, if you're okay with this, are you okay with going to 8:10 just so we can talk a little bit about the literary argument? Are you like, Timm? Nope, I turn into a pumpkin at 8 o'clock.
No, that's fine.
Okay. So one of the things that I want to just point out, folks, once again, is that there's an entire poetry playlist right down below. There's a literary effects playlist. We're going to get Celine's slides in there. So I'm sorry that we couldn't read your poem, but I should have figured this would happen because we're English teachers. And what do? We talk and we go. Like, let's be real. But I do want to talk a little bit about the question 3 real quick, because that is the only time, it's the only part of the lit exam where kids have to actually know something themselves and they need to bring it to the table. Like they're not responding to some sort of like stimulus. It's them actually bringing the content to the table. So my question for you is, when we think about the question 3, which is a literary argument, what do you do to help your students prepare for test day because they don't know what the prompt is going to be? And how do we know that they have something to pick and whatnot? What is the way that you do it? And then I'll share how I do it.
Yeah, again, we're just we looked at different prompts. We're going to come back to FRQ3 in my class again this week, but reminding the students of the text that they know well.
Yeah.
And so, make a list. I'm sure your teachers have done this with you, but make a list of works that you have read. You can start with works that you have read this year in class. You can go back to works that you read last year. Any whole text that that's, a complete work.
Yeah.
And so as you're looking at that, it's not going to behoove you to study all of them over again. What I'm telling my students, and Timm can, weigh in on this, is that I really suggest 3.
Yep.
I suggest that they only prepare 3 longer works. And I suggest that they vary their selections so that the works kind of approach different big ideas. It's really up to them. And so as they're thinking about, maybe they're going to choose a play, maybe they're going to choose a work that is more of like a world an author of the world,
Yeah.
or literature, as opposed to the traditional American or just British, or maybe they really have an affinity for an American author that we read. I told my kids this the other day. I have been teaching for 26 years, and whether it's the best idea or not, I tend to switch out works frequently.
Yep.
I don't stick with the same text from year to year simply because there's such a large and important body of work that is ever changing out there. And I'm not trying to just highlight one work over another. I'm using them as vehicles to really expand their experience with great writing. And
Okay,
so,
hold on one second. I
oh,
have to
sorry.
give a shout out. No, I'm interrupting you, but I
No, it's
have to
fine.
give a shout out because someone just beggeth of thee that we shout out their teacher, and I'm like, I gotta. How do you not shout that out? So, a shout out to Ms. Huddleston. Back to you, Celine. Please forgive me.
No. And so, I'm going to tell you this: we don't judge the selection of your text. That's nowhere on the rubric. I mean, you can pull up all of the rubrics. Nowhere does it say judge your text. We're still looking at you responding to the prompt with a defensible interpretation. The biggest pitfall that I see is that students select a work that immediately pops into their head and they don't remember the work as well as they
Yeah.
immediately thought they did. Remember that little 8 to 10 minutes plan I had there for question 2.
Yep.
And so, but okay, after Tim shares, I'll show a screen real quick.
No, no, no. You. Oh, sorry. You can
Oh, no.
share right now. I didn't know you were going to share. You share it up.
Well, I just thought about it. So I was like, well,
Okay.
I might as well. Um, what they practice with, and it's a version, if you will, of speed dating, and I'm sure your kids or your teachers have done something like this, is to think about what they have read, but remember, you still should take that planning time. The same planning time. You're sort of forced to take planning time with poetry and with prose because you have new material to read.
Yeah.
And so it seems natural to you to take time to process it. Well, you need to take that 8 to 10 minutes as well for question 3. And you need to process making a selection of a text, a longer work that is going to suit not only the prompt, but information that you know well. And so
Yeah.
I would still outline, and my kids were like, what? 2 books? No, you're only writing on 1 book. But don't just jump into it head first and then realize halfway through that essay that you have nothing else to say, or that you hadn't really adequately planned out your line of reasoning with what you're going to use to support your interpretation, your response to the prompt. So take some time. I'm talking like a good old fashioned T chart. You all know about those T charts, right? So on
Yeah.
like one left side, put one work that came to your mind that was going to respond to it that you know well. On the other side, put a work that you know well. And honestly, really start to think, what are those pieces of evidence? You're not going to have the work in front of you. So what is it that you remember with specificity? What is it
Yeah.
that you're going to use that's going to show your knowledge of that text in response to supporting your thesis? And actually try to write it out. I mean, try to write out these drafts of what it is. The difference, and I will say this here for question 3, is that it is
Yeah.
required that you respond to an interpretation of the work as a whole, which is theme.
Yeah.
So unlike question 1 and 2, the expectation is there, and it is in the rubric for row B. Row B has a caveat in the notes at the bottom that you have to respond to the interpretation of the work as a whole in order to be eligible to earn the 4 points, the highest point allocation. You could still potentially earn a 3 in row B if you don't discuss interpretation of the work as a whole theme, but you have to have discussed that interpretation of the work as a whole, those thematic ideas, in order to be eligible to earn the full 4 points in row B. So just keep that in mind for question 3. And so for my students, I want them to spend time thinking about 2 potential viable responses, and then make a selection for what's going to work for them but again, like I said,
Yeah.
no one's judging what you select. We are right. We're looking at your writing. We're looking that you have
Right.
an interpretation of the work as a whole. And we are looking that you are still addressing the complexity of this piece because you know this text. You have read it, you have studied it. Some of you theater students have, performed it.
Yeah. Right. Oh, did I lose you, Celine? Oh, no, I got you.
Oh, no, sorry.
Yeah,
And
catch up.
so one of the last things, just as again, a reminder, because I see this every year on the exam, students see this list of potential works. It's not meant to be some kind of demand. No one expects that any teacher taught all of these. No one expects that any student has read all of these. All they're suggesting is that, these longer works would appropriately respond to this topic. And they're trying to let you understand, to open up your understanding that this prompt is that it's a prompt that is inviting you as a student to bring forward your knowledge of a body of work that you can show us what you know about it.
Yeah.
It's that invitation. All of these works, look at there's so many there because there's so many potential opportunities in what you know to respond. So I do encourage you not just to take time to decide on the longer work to use, but know that lots of works are potentially appropriate for a response to this. But ultimately, it's your choice to decide on what to write. Okay, sorry, let me get out of that then.
No, that's okay. So first of all, shout out to Mr. Martin. Shout out to Ms. Austin. So there's a question about poetry that I will answer after I deal with this part of question 3, which is about the point of view influencing the understanding of the poem. So I will go back to that. But Celine, if you're like, if that is after the fact, feel free to be like, hey, I got to sign off, Tim. That's okay. I do want to just talk about one thing that you had mentioned in relation to question 3, and that's when you had said, it's really important for kids to know books that they can bring to the table for question 3 because they need to be able to talk about it specifically. And you had mentioned 2 books. In the description down below this particular video, I do have what I make my kids do, which are called literature logs. I require my kids to do 2 of these. One book has to be one of the longer works that we read in class. And I typically read for longer works Alice in Wonderland, Macbeth, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, and Frankenstein, because I've never seen a prompt that can't be answered by one of those 4. So I am unlike you. I like to stay in my rut, I guess, for the lack of a better term. But I also have like 5 kids where I'm always running around to hockey, and I can't, read like I'd like to and things like that. Not that I don't read, but anyway, nonetheless, I totally understand where you're coming from, though. But I choose those 4, and I say you have to write about one of those, and then you can pick whatever other book that you want to write about. My caveat is no Hunger Games and Twilight, just because I hate them. But they can potentially work, and if you know them, don't be afraid to use them. But folks, I want to just point out that in my literature log, it tells kids exactly what to do, and the reason why is because it says, hey, focus on some events and the characters and how they interrelate in these events. And I always require my kids to write a minimum of 3 sentences and a maximum of 5 for these directions. And the reason why is because my students, to stay out of summary mode when they write their question 3, I always tell them, when you put evidence in an essay for a question 3, the most amount of sentences you're allowed to put in any paragraph of evidence is 5. So that means if you have a topic sentence, that's 1 sentence. You can have up to 5 sentences describing what's going on in the story that you're going to use as proof. And then at minimum, they have to follow that with 3 sentences of commentary. And so that means that the smallest paragraph my kids will ever write is 1, 5, 6, 6, and 3 is 9 sentences long. But I got to get my kids practicing because you had mentioned that kids are often not specific enough. And I tell my kids, when you put your evidence in this essay, it cannot be less than 3 sentences per paragraph. And the reason why is I want my kids really focusing on not going too much into summary mode, but also not going too much into not non-specificity or abstraction, as we would call it. So I have this here, folks, which talks about major events. I have another one that talks about a minor or unseen character. I have another one that says, hey, go find 2 to 4 major conflicts and their resolutions and describe them. And then I have important settings, important symbols, and then their universal ideas, and they have to create 3 thematic statements. And this is what they have to do for 2 books, and turn those into me before exam day, because the day before the exam, when they come in the morning, day of the exam, I could just hand those to them and say, you've got a half an hour into your exam. Why don't you just reread and keep these major books fresh in your mind? The other thing that I also do, though, Celine, and you might hate this, but I also have my kids find a very quick quote that relates thematically to the book, because I always tell them, if you're writing a killer conclusion and you can get a quick quote in there from somebody famous at the end, it could be a cool mic drop. So if I were writing about like Of Mice and Men, and I was writing a really negative essay about how the American dream is like no good, imagine reading a great paper, Celine. You read a cool conclusion, and then at the very end, and it's like, and truthfully, it's just inevitable. Like Bernie Sanders has claimed all along, for many Americans, the American dream has become a nightmare. Like, getting that, would you not be pumped about that if you were a reader? Like, oh, this kid knew that.
There are always the mic drop moments that are celebrated, and the kids do some amazing things in their writing. But again, sort of as a back to what I meant earlier, I do want mine to prepare at least 3. Kind of, I don't have these logs like you, but prepare at least 3. I know that those get anxious. So Sam, I'm kind of like you. Like, I'm like, pick 4 works that you can review your knowledge of.
Yeah.
But when they get into the test day, I want them at least to weigh more than one book, like plan kind of out what they're doing so that they're not just launching.
Right. Because a lot of times my kids might pick the wrong book for the wrong prompt. And it's like, no, you shouldn't have used Frankenstein because you only planned for Frankenstein. You should have used, A, B, C, or D. Shout out to Mr. Sorensen, by the way, and Ms. Austin again as well. But yeah, that's a big fear of mine. And if anybody's interested in those lit logs, by the way, they are linked up right down below in the description as well. Sorry, Celine, keep going.
I thought it was great. Like, I saw the paragraph thing. I have resources like for my students to kind of look at and review on their own. And I have a reference to your website. So like, same thing.
Yeah.
I have them directed to some of your, playlists to kind of choose their own adventure in terms of, bolstering areas that they feel are that they're in need of, like just as a reminder, as a refresher. I also think it's important for them to see other ways that people approach it. Obviously I'm in Texas. You were currently in Massachusetts, but you're going to be relocating. You'll be in Las Vegas. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's important just to hear different ways of approaching it. I mean, ultimately, we're all looking for the same thing. The students to show us we're excited. I mean, I'm excited. Next week, you're going to be doing an amazing job. I know some of you may feel stressed, but your teachers have worked with you so they're still working with you. They're there for you. They're stressed out too. And y'all are going to be amazing. Yeah. But we're
moments. Rooting for you.
Yeah, these are the moments. And as a reader, I mean, I've been doing it for 20 years. I'm not doing it because I have nothing else to do. I am doing it because I love doing that with students and seeing, well, they're not there, but I can hear your voices. It's like I'm surrounded by and reading thousands of students who have engaged with literature, who are expressing their ideas about it. And so know that at the reading, we're not looking to be punitive. I mean, there's nothing on the rubric that says take away points.
Right.
I'm trying to follow your ideas and to celebrate those and to reward you where I can, and to direct everyone who's scoring your essays to be the same way. Like, I'm one of the people who will pick, the samples, and we'll look at applying the rubric, and all of it works in support.
Yeah.
We believe in you.
Right. It's true. Shout out to Mrs. Epstein's class, by the way. We were asked for that. I do have a couple other questions I have to answer. Celine, I know that it is getting late for the time that we talked about. So if you got to go, you got to go. That's okay. I can wrap things up. But folks, Celine will be back with me next Tuesday to do the night before cram. And also, just so everybody knows, the questions that you have here that you might think were not answered, look at the playlist down below, because they probably are answered in those videos. And then, oh yeah, you know what, Celine, can you actually just drop the link to your slideshow in this public chat here, and then I'll copy and paste it in? That'd be great. And so shout out to Mr. Jones as well. But let me deal with a couple other things here, folks. Somebody asked, And so you can leave as you see fit. So no pressure here or anything like that. I just don't want you to feel like you're obligated to stay when we were like, hey, 7 to 8, can we do this, right?
Yeah, I'll log out, but I'm still logged in as a subscriber. So I'll
Gotcha.
put it in your chat.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you very much.
See y'all later.
Bye, Celine. Somebody asked on here, what books can I recommend for a question 3? And the truth is, you can write about any book you want. Okay. Here's what I recommend that kids have prepared. I don't necessarily give titles, although there are some titles that I think work really well. And those are the 4 that I listed earlier, which would be Jekyll and Hyde, Macbeth, Frankenstein, and Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. But I chose those 4 because I actually care more about what they include when I think about all of the prompts that I could possibly ever see. I do think that going into test day, you should have a book that looks at a character who grows up. I think that you have to have a book under your belt with a character who is either obsessed with money or power, and not necessarily obsessed in a bad way. I think about Mice and Men. They were chasing after the American dream and the money that kind of goes with that. So we've got the money type of thing going on right there. Okay. I think so. We have a book about growing up. We have a book about power and money. You should have a book about ethics under your belt. Like, is this ethical? Is this not ethical? And then a book about that has something humorous in it. Somebody asked about Mango Street as being a good book for question 3. Absolutely. Okay. I think that's a great book to use for question 3 if it fits the prompt itself, because you don't want to choose a book that doesn't fit the topic of the prompt because you've only reviewed one book. And so for my students, I always say, hey, listen, we want to make sure we have one about someone growing up. We want to make sure that we have one about some obsession with power or wealth. One about one that can be considered having at least one humorous moment. Okay. And typically, if you can get through those kind of 3 criteria, you're going to be in decent shape. You also want to always have one book where you're absolutely clear of at least one symbol that means something. Now, all the books that I mentioned for my kids, we talk about the symbolism, we talk about the motifs and things like that. So my kids can do that, but that's what you want to think about. And if honestly, if you're the biggest Harry Potter fan in the world, then know what Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone reads like. I would suggest that of all the Harry Potters, that the Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone is the one that is the most complete story, even though it goes on for the next 6 books, because it's entirely the hero's journey. And so you see that full hero's journey come full circle. I want to answer a question about poetry that was brought up before. So I'm going to revert back to poetry here for a minute. Somebody asked if the point of view of the author has an effect on understanding the poem. And the answer is absolutely yes. Okay, but only if you can tell. And then you're like, wait a second, what? So yes, but only if you could tell. My point is this. First of all, an author and a speaker are not the same thing. The author is the person who writes the poem, but the speaker might be the author or might not be the author. Okay, so we always want to assume that the person who's narrating the poem as you read it is just the speaker, unless you know it's the author. But for example, a poem that I could think of that's told in the 3rd person is a poem by Lai Young Lee called A Story. And some of you might have seen it in your AP Lit class. And that particular poem is told in a 3rd person limited point of view. And it's really important because this particular poem is about a father who has a child on his lap. The child asks for a story. The father can't think of one. So he gets super anxious thinking that his son's going to give up on him and just leave in the future because he couldn't think of a story. And then it comes back to the here and the now. And the father still stays silent, but it's because he loves his son so much, he doesn't want to disappoint him, but it ends up being a disappointment, but it's actually a really poignant and loving moment at the end. Now, I bring this up because you might say, well, how does a 3rd person limited narrator actually affect that poem? Well, it does a lot because first of all, having a 3rd person narrator creates a disconnect. Well, guess what the conflict of the story is? There is a disconnect between the father and the son. By having it be a limited point of view, it's 3rd person limited, so the narrator only has access to the father's thoughts here. That's really important because that's where the father is. He's only in his mind. So the disconnect is illustrated by the limited access to only the father's thoughts. The kid just wanted a story. We see the kid sitting on his lap. That's seen, so that's not access to thoughts. The kid verbally asks for a story, and the father is in an entirely separate world because he just doesn't want to disappoint his son. Another example of point of view in a story that can help really well is a short story called Hills Like White Elephants. There's a couple in that story that are having a struggle, and they will not tell each other what each other actually think. They will not reveal their thoughts to the other part of the couple. And because of that, they get almost no resolution. That's a third person objective story. That's important. Why? Because the disconnect of the thoughts, third person objective, is when the narrator has access to nobody's thoughts. That's important because our characters' conflict is because they're not willing to tell each other what they're thinking. They do not have access to each other's thoughts. So they're separated with no access to their true thoughts, and it's amplifying the conflict of their discussion that happens throughout. I can think of another poem called The Albuquerque Graveyard, which is a first person poem about segregation and also feeling like you're part of a community, but also not part of a community because you're a failure. It's told in the first person, and it's really important because you see the speaker slow down in the first person as he becomes to be a little bit more self-critical. It's also in the first person because this speaker feels isolated from his overall community and the microcosm of his African American community that he's actually in. And so that first person narration isolates the speaker. It amplifies his internal struggle, but because he's isolated, I can then translate that to my understanding of the poem. So the answer is yes, point of view does affect it. However, if you notice a point of view and you can't correlate it to greater meaning, don't try to write about it. Oh, one more short story, The Mask of the Red Death. That's a third person omniscient narrator. And what's really important about that is that with all of the access that you have, actually, no, Mask of the Red Death is third person, second person, and first person. There's elements of all types of that kind of point of view in there. That's important because the whole point of the story is that death hits everybody. And sure enough, this story has first person, second person, and third person. First person means the narrator. Second person means the audience is involved. It's like you statements. And third person is the collective amount of characters. And so if the whole story is meant to illustrate that death touches every person and you can't escape it, well, you have a narration strike there. I mean, the narration is like that as well. So I hope that I answered that question about point of view and having an effect there. So that is that. No, the College Board does not reuse FRQ3 prompts. So just a note from that. Sorry, I gotta look. If people want quick elements about analyzing poetry and stuff like that, you can look at the playlist for poetry down below. All right, so the next one of the questions was, is our next live stream going to be the same? The answer is yes and no. The night before is always us just trying to address as many questions as possible. Today, we really wanted to look at poetry because that's what kids really seem to struggle with the most, and also getting kids to just realize you need to plan out the books that you know for your question 3. Okay, next week, it's going to kind of almost be like a free-for-all. We'll take questions, but we'll come in and we'll start talking about multiple choice. Then we'll talk about poetry, then prose, and then question 3. But you might hear us repeating some certain things there. Okay. Let me see. Shout out to Mr. Tereshko. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. Shout out to Mrs. Jones. And I think, folks, that I am... Okay, Caitlin, you have here... Could there ever be a question 3 topic about racial tension? The answer is there's always a possibility, but I will say this, that they try to keep anything that they put on the exam as inclusive as possible in terms of kids' experiences. So what if, like, we can't guarantee, or not we, I'm not the College Board. The College Board can't guarantee that a student has ever experienced a piece of literature that deals with racial tension. Now, we can hope, the College Board can hope that's the case, but they can't guarantee it. What they can guarantee is that if you've taken AP Literature, you've read something that has a symbol in it. Or what you can guarantee is that if you're taking AP Literature, there's going to be some sort of character that struggles with a power dynamic. So is it possible that they could talk about racial tension in question 3? Yeah, it's possible. Do I think you'll see that? No. But also, whenever I say I don't think you'll see something, that's typically what you see. So just be prepared for it. It's certainly possible. Okay. All right, Vincent, we can take as long as we want to read your essays. On average, I think the average essay is read between 2 and 5 minutes, depending on the reader that gets it. Okay. Okay, Lexi, for question 3, how do you quickly grab evidence and commentary? I'm going to actually send you to the question 3 playlist down below in the description. And I'm not trying to like write off your question here, but it is 8:30 and I got 5 kids and I got to go to bed. And I got to get them in bed. Let's see. What are the main theme prompts require work to have for question 3? Is there a book that I recommend to prep for question 3? Folks, if you really want a book from me to prep for question 3, I would suggest to go listen to Macbeth. Or another short one that you could do is, I'm going to give suggestions for 3 short works that you could listen to within 2 hours. You could listen to Macbeth within 2 hours, but Macbeth also has our archaic English, and so because of that, it might be really hard for some of you to comprehend, and that's okay. The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. If you go to YouTube and just type in the Metamorphosis audiobook, play that. The Metamorphosis is like 55 pages long, and that can get you a lot. And it's about a guy who wakes up as a bug. Like he actually wakes up as a cockroach. And so that's kind of a fun book there. So Macbeth will work really well. The Metamorphosis will work well. Of Mice and Men is a quick book to get through, and because it's like 100 pages. The Little Prince is a good book to get through if you want to. I also like Peter Pan a lot. And there was one other one. Oh, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. All of these, you can go to YouTube, look up an audiobook for it, and crank it out. And if you're looking for a book that's actually going to come across pretty simple, but actually is really deep, Animal Farm works really well too. And I just encourage you, and there are a million other books, folks. Feel free to toss them in the chat that you love if they're nice and short. I'm just thinking of really short works that are popping into my head right now that have a lot of literary depth. And if you go to YouTube, type in audiobook for blah, 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 it's going to be there. And like I said, most of these are, 2 to 3 hour listens to kind of help that. Okay. Now, listen, folks, I appreciate you all. And we're going to shut this down for the night. We'll be back the night before the exam. Tell your friends. And I appreciate y'all. Shout out to all your teachers. I hope I grabbed almost all of them. And yeah, I think that's that. Mrs. Huddleston, yeah, we definitely shouted her out. Mrs. Robinson, if I missed you. Mr. Jones. Let's see, anybody else there? I don't think so. So you all have a great night, and hopefully we'll see you next week.